Here she comes. Here she comes.
Oi, como vai? Tudo bem? Welcome back to Portuguese Lessons with Professor Jason. In today's lesson, I'm going to cover the forms and uses of the future subjunctive in Brazilian Portuguese. Now, I say Brazilian Portuguese, but really everything I'm going to go over in terms of grammar today applies to Portuguese in general. Now, perhaps some of the examples I'm going to give will have a more Brazilian feel, and my pronunciation is not European, but other than that, this lesson and most of my other lessons in Portuguese apply to Portuguese broadly, alright? The future subjunctive can be a somewhat tricky topic for a couple of different reasons. First, not all languages use a future subjunctive. In Spanish, for example, it's not used at all anymore, right? They used to use the future subjunctive, not anymore in Espanol. Another thing that complicates this topic a bit is that many forms in the future subjunctive actually coincide exactly with forms in the personal infinitive. Okay, I've uploaded a separate lesson covering the personal infinitive if you're interested. So I addressed both of these issues in the course of this lesson. All right, what I'm going to do is to go over the verb forms first, and then I'll explain when future subjunctive forms have to be used. I'm going to provide plenty of examples so that hopefully it'll start to make more and more sense as we go through the lesson. All right, so let's start off by talking about the forms of the future subjunctive. Now, as with other verb forms, the forms for the future subjunctive reflect the combination of a stem with endings corresponding to the subject that performs the action. Let's have a look at the first slide. Coming up with the right stem is crucial. The stem is derived by conjugating the desired verb in the third person plural or eles, elas form of the preterite or definite past. What we do then is remove the final two letters. That gives us the basic stem for the future subjunctive. Now, I've heard other instructors who say to remove the final four letters or the final three letters, but removing just the last two letters works perfectly well, or even better, because this allows us to apply a single set of endings to all three classes of verbs, AR, ER, and IR verbs. Beginning with the third person plural, the preterite, is crucial because the future subjunctive stems maintain any irregularities seen in the preterite. And there are several verbs with irregular preterite stems, as you can see from this slide. So the slide shows a regular AR verb, falar, regular ER verb, comer, and a regular IR verb, partir, and then a dozen or so verbs with irregular preterite forms. And you can see that we have the third person plural, the preterite, conjugated, and then in green I've separated what would be the stem. And you can see how those irregular verbs maintain those irregular stems. Once we've identified the stem for the verb we want to conjugate in the future subjunctive, we add the endings you can see on the second column of this slide, right? Now the slide shows examples of three regular verbs, same verbs we saw in the previous slide, as well as one irregular verb as an example. But note that there's only one set of endings, and that we really don't alter, as we add the endings, we don't alter the first person, the você, or the third person singular forms at all. Okay? So we take the verb, for example, falaram, remove the final two letters, falar is our stem, or querer, we take quiseram, remove the am, we have quiser, and we add the endings you can see in blue in the second column to get the future subjunctive forms for each of the subject pronoun positions. Another thing that's important to point out is that the endings we see here for the future subjunctive are the same as those that we add to infinitives to personalize them. Now this is important because lots of non-native and even some native speakers at times confuse the forms of the future subjunctive and the personal infinitive. And that's because even though the forms of the future subjunctive and personal infinitive are in fact derived from different stems, in the cases of regular verbs they coincide exactly. And we can see this pretty clearly if we take a side-by-side look at these forms, or the forms for a regular AR verb like falar. So you can see that even though the formation of the stem is different, it happens to yield the same stem, falar. Since the endings are the same, the forms for the future subjunctive and personal infinitive coincide exactly. Now here's another example of the coincidence in future subjunctive and personal infinitive forms. this time with another ER verb, regular verb, or a regular ER verb, comer. So again, on this slide we can just see that although the formula for arriving at the stem is different, right? Future subjunctive, take the third person plural of the preterite, comeron, and remove the am. For the personal infinitive, the stem is the infinitive, but because the stems end up being the same, then all the forms happen to coincide. Now, this is a little bit different when a verb has an irregular stem in the preterite. Here our forms are not going to coincide. A side-by-side comparison of the forms of querer provides a good example of this lack of coincidence between the future subjunctive and the personal infinitive forms. So we can see here that because the third person plural of the preterite of querer is quiseron, we remove the am, we come up with quiser, as we've seen previously. That's going to differ from the stem for the personal infinitive forms querer. One more example of this would be the verb dizer, which means to say or to tell. Okay? This again is an example of non-coincidence between the future subjunctive and the personal infinitive forms. Same reason. The third person plural, the preterite, is dizeron. We remove the am, we come up with dizer, but the stem for the personal infinitive is the infinitive, dizer. Okay? So we have the corresponding differences even though we add the same endings. When it comes to the future subjunctive, it's really important to learn which verbs have irregular stems in the preterite and to memorize them. Not just so that we don't confuse them with the personal infinitive stems, but also because these verbs tend to be extremely common in everyday speech. So, if you need to review which common verbs in Portuguese have irregular stems in the preterite, you can always go back to that first slide in the presentation, to that list that I provided. Alright? Now, before going on to talk about when we use the future subjunctive, let me make one last observation about irregular forms in the preterite, the future subjunctive, and the personal infinitive. It's actually more of a warning or a linguistic heads up. When navigating these tenses, we have to be especially careful with the verbs ver, to see, and vir, to come. Not only are both verbs irregular in the preterite, but their forms are so similar that keeping them straight, separate, using the right ones, gives even native speakers some occasional trouble. Take a look at this next slide to see what I mean. Now, if we take a nice long look at this slide, and we might want to pause the video here, we will see that not only do both of these verbs have irregular third-person preterite stems, right? In the case of ver, to see, it's viron. In the case of vir, to come, it's vier. Not only do they both have irregular third-person preterite stems, but the really crazy and confusing coincidence is that the forms of the future subjunctive of ver, to see, and the personal infinitive of vir, to come, happen to be identical. Wow, when you think about it, that really is kind of a nightmare, huh? But try not to dwell on it. Like I said, it's just something to be aware of. Take comfort in the thought that making mistakes with ver and vir is inevitable, but rarely fatal. Okay? Anyway, now that we've mastered how to form the future subjunctive in Portuguese, let's talk about when we actually use it. This part I think is pretty straightforward. First, the future subjunctive is used after certain adverbial conjunctions of time. What are those? We'll see in a minute. When they're used to indicate that one action is dependent on a specific instance of a future action, an action that by definition may or may not actually transpire. Again, this sounds all kind of abstract, but you'll see with the examples. Alright? I've put these conjunctions together on a slide along with their English and Spanish equivalents. Let's have a look. The first one, cuando, is extremely common. It means when. The Spanish is, of course, cuando. Second one, depois que, means after. In Spanish, it's después de que. Third one in Portuguese, enquanto, means while or as long as something happens. The Spanish is mientras que. And then finally, a couple that both mean as soon as. Assim que and logo que. In Spanish, the equivalents are en cuanto and tan pronto como. Now, when it comes to these types of adverbial clauses, or adverbial conjunctions, having a solid grasp of Spanish grammar can actually help, because even though the future subjunctive is all but extinct in modern Spanish, Spanish will require the present subjunctive to be used when referring to future actions preceded by similar adverbial conjunctions, things like cuando, hasta que, después de que, mientras que, en cuanto, en tan pronto como. Have a look at these examples in Portuguese and Spanish to see what I mean. So if I want to say, we're going to have dinner when they arrive. Vamos jantar cuando eles chegarem. Or in Spanish, vamos a cenar cuando ellos lleguen. Now here what's happening again is we're referring to an action that may or may not happen in the future. When they arrive. It's almost when and if they arrive. That's how you have to think about it. Second example, if I wanted to express I'm going to talk to her after we get out of class, again, the key is I'm referring to class today. A specific instance in the future hasn't happened yet, may not happen. Vou falar com ela depois que sairmos da aula. In Spanish, you would use the present subjunctive. Voy a hablar con ella después de que salgamos de la clase. Okay? If I wanted to say, to tell you in a command form, send news while you're there in Argentina, Portuguese, mandem notícias enquanto estiverem lá na Argentina. So using the future subjunctive because we're talking about a duration in time that we don't know how long it is or when it will end. Mandem notícias enquanto estiverem lá na Argentina. In Spanish, present subjunctive. Mandem notícias mientras que estén allá en Argentina. Last example here. Anna will write the article when she has gathered all the data. She hasn't gathered it yet. When she has, she'll write the article. Ana vai escrever o artigo assim que reunir todos os dados. Assim que reunir, as soon as she has it all together. Ana va a escribir el artículo en cuanto reúna, present subjunctive, todos los datos. So again, what I wanted to show you here was sort of the correspondence between the future subjunctive in Portuguese and Spanish having to use the present subjunctive when referring to a future action that hasn't transpired yet. Now, one key thing to understand is that when these kinds of adverbial conjunctions of time do not introduce a specific instance of an action set in the future, then technically the future subjunctive shouldn't be used. This would be the case when we're describing what people usually do rather than what they will do. Note the differences in these examples. So if I say, sempre jantamos quando papai chega do trabalho, I mean to say, we always have dinner when dad gets home from work. I'm not talking about a specific instance when he will get home. I'm talking about in general, what we do habitually. Or if I say, falo com ela depois que saímos da aula. What I mean to say is, I usually talk to her after we get out of class. It's customary for me to do this. So I'm not describing a specific future situation that may or may not happen. I'm talking about what I usually do. Same with this variation. Ela escreve os artigos logo que reúne todos os dados. She typically writes her article once she has gathered all of the data. Okay, now in terms of frequency, the future subjunctive probably appears most often after the subordinating conjunction if, se, se in Portuguese. Now this happens when one action is seen as dependent on another that's part of an if clause that refers to a specific future instance of an action. Again, one that may or may not actually occur. Here are some examples of the future subjunctive after if clauses. Eles vão cancelar o piquenique se chover amanhã. They are going to cancel the picnic if it rains tomorrow. Specific instance in the future that may or may not happen. If it rains. Se chover amanhã. Avise-me se não puder vir à festa. Let me know if you won't be able to come to the party. Vou te visitar se achar uma passagem barata. I'm going to visit you if I find a cheap fare. Again, in these cases, we're talking about a specific instance in the future that may or may not transpire. Vamos comprar essa casa se conseguirmos o empréstimo. We're going to buy that home if we get the loan. Você vai se mudar para Chicago se aceitar esse emprego? Você vai se mudar para Chicago se aceitar esse emprego? So, if you accept that job in the future, you haven't done it yet, if you accept that job, will you move to Chicago? However, if the main clause does not depend on an if clause that introduces a specific instance of an action set in the future, or if it describes a usual or habitual action, then technically the future subjunctive should not be used after an if clause. Note the differences in these examples. Não sei se iremos ao cinema. I don't know if we'll go to the movies. Here the action in the main clause, I don't know, my knowing, is not dependent on whether or not we actually go to the movies. Ela prefere comer em casa se tem tempo. She prefers to eat at home if she has time. I'm talking about in general, not if she has time tomorrow, not if she has time next week. In general, ela prefere comer em casa se tem tempo. Se eu ganhasse a loteria, compraria essa casa. Se eu ganhasse a loteria, compraria essa casa. This one's a little bit different because we're talking about a completely hypothetical, contrary to fact occurrence. If I were to win the lottery, not very likely, what would I do? I would buy that house. So again, I'm not referring to something that's a specific instance of an event in the future. Now I should also point out that some other conjunctions such as como, as, and onde, where, can also refer to unrealized future actions, and in those cases they also have to be followed by the future subjunctive. Let's take a look at 3 quick examples. If I want to tell someone, finish the project however you want. Termine o projeto como você quiser. Termine o projeto como você quiser, however you want. You can park wherever you find a space. Pode estacionar seu carro onde achar uma vaga. Onde achar uma vaga, wherever you find a space. And we'll get together wherever you want. Vamos nos reunir onde você quiser, wherever you want. Onde você quiser. The decision hasn't been made yet, may not be made yet, but in any case, we don't know where. Onde você quiser. Keep in mind really quickly while my mind is on it, if we were to change this to whenever you want, we would also be using the future subjunctive. Vamos nos reunir quando você quiser, whenever you want. So wherever, whenever, however, future subjunctive. Okay, now I said this was going to be straightforward, but it's turning out to be a lot to remember. Realistically, my advice would be to focus on just a couple of the uses of the future subjunctive in Portuguese to begin with. And by far, clauses involving the conjunctions when and if are the most common, I think. So let's close out this lesson with a few more examples featuring quando and se. Podemos ver esse filme quando você quiser. We can see that movie whenever you want. Or if I want to say, I'm leaving when we finish studying. Of course, we haven't finished yet, but when and if we do, I'm leaving. Eu vou embora quando terminarmos de estudar. Vou embora quando terminarmos de estudar. I'll call you later when I get there. Again, when and if I get there in the future. Eu te ligo mais tarde quando chegar lá. Quando chegar lá. When I get there. You can call me if you need anything tomorrow. Pode me ligar se precisar. Se precisar de qualquer coisa amanhã. I don't want to go if they don't go. Eu não quero ir se eles não forem. I don't know if they'll go. Se eles não forem. You all won't arrive today if you miss that bus. You won't arrive today if you miss that bus. Vocês não vão chegar hoje se perderem esse ônibus. Vocês não vão chegar hoje se perderem esse ônibus. Alright, that concludes my presentation on the forms and uses of the future subjunctive in Brazilian Portuguese. I hope you found it to be informative and helpful. As always, I welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions, so please do take a moment, leave a comment, and let me know what you thought about this video lesson. If you like this video, I hope you'll check out my other lessons covering topics in Portuguese and Spanish. You can also find more content on my website at professorjason.com. Please join my Facebook community at facebook.com/ProfessorJason. You can also follow me on Twitter. I know, I'm everywhere. Once again, this has been Professor Jason. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video lesson. Até logo. Ciao.
Here she comes. Here she comes.